She humiliated the scarred war hero who loved her. 2 years later, his revenge shocked the entire town. What he did next left everyone speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Anderson was a decorated Marine Corps veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. At 28, his broad shoulders and military posture commanded respect, but the deep scars on his face and the slight limp in his walk told stories of battles he'd rather forget. Back in his hometown of Cedar Springs, Montana, he struggled to adjust to civilian life, haunted by memories of war and feeling out of place in the peaceful mountain town he once called home. Despite his challenges, there was one person who always brought light to his darkest days: Rachel Mitchell. She was the town's most successful real estate agent, known for her stunning looks and charm that could sell a shack for mansion prices. Marcus had loved her since high school, before he enlisted, and their occasional letters during his deployment had kept his hope alive. She was the reason he fought so hard to come home. What Marcus didn't know was that Rachel had changed during the years he was away. Success had made her cold, calculating, and obsessed with social status. The small-town girl who once shared ice cream with him at the local diner had transformed into someone who saw people as stepping stones to greater heights. But Marcus, lost in his memories of their past, was blind to who she had become. News of his return spread quickly through Cedar Springs. People whispered about the war hero coming home, some with admiration, others with pity. But Marcus only cared about one person's opinion. When Rachel reached out to welcome him back, his heart soared. Maybe, just maybe, the dreams that had kept him going through gunfire and explosions weren't just fantasies after all. The days following his return were a blur of well-wishers and painful memories. Marcus spent most of his time at the Veterans Center, trying to piece together a life that made sense. The medication helped with the physical pain, but nothing could ease the ache in his heart whenever he thought of his fallen brothers. His therapist suggested he needed something to look forward to, a reason to embrace civilian life again. That's when Rachel's message arrived. "Let's have dinner at La Maison tomorrow night, for old times' sake." La Maison was Cedar Springs' most expensive restaurant, a place where the town's elite gathered to see and be seen. Marcus spent his entire day's disability check on a new suit, determined to look his best. He even asked his sister Sarah to help him cover the worst of his scars with makeup, something he'd never considered before. As he walked into the restaurant that evening, Marcus couldn't help but notice the stares. Some were curious, others sympathetic. A few even seemed disgusted by his appearance. But he held his head high, the way he'd been trained. Rachel was already there, stunning in a red dress that probably cost more than his monthly pension. She smiled, but something about it didn't reach her eyes. "Marcus," she said, standing to greet him, "you look different." Her hesitation cut deeper than any shrapnel ever had. Throughout dinner, Rachel kept checking her phone, barely listening as Marcus shared carefully selected stories from his time overseas. He avoided the worst memories, focusing instead on moments of camaraderie and hope. But Rachel seemed more interested in being seen with a war hero than actually connecting with him. Then came the moment that would haunt Marcus for months to come. Rachel's business partner, James Hartford, approached their table. Tall, handsome, and unscarred, he represented everything Marcus used to be. "Rachel, darling," James called out, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "What's this I hear about you settling for dinner with a broken soldier? You know you deserve better than damaged goods." Marcus expected Rachel to defend him, to show even a fraction of the warmth she'd expressed in her letters. Instead, she laughed. The sound was like ice in his veins. "Oh, James, don't be mean," she said, but her smile betrayed her amusement. "I just felt sorry for him, you know how it is. Small town, everyone expects you to be nice to the local hero." She turned to Marcus, her eyes cold. Did you really think someone like me would be interested in someone like you now? The letters were sweet, but let's be realistic. Look at yourself. The restaurant had gone silent. Marcus could feel every eye on him, could hear the whispers starting. His hands, which had steadied rifles and saved fellow soldiers, trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. The walls seemed to close in, and for a moment, he was back in that burned-out building in Kandahar, surrounded by enemies, but this time without his team to back him up. Without a word, he stood and walked out, his military training the only thing keeping him upright. Behind him, he could hear Rachel's laughter mixing with James's, the sound following him into the cold Montana night. As he limped home through the empty streets, Marcus felt something inside him change. The warm memories of the past crystallized into something harder, colder. The man who had gone to war believing in love and honor died that night, replaced by someone who understood that true battles weren't fought with bullets, but with cunning and patience. Little did Rachel know, but her cruel game had awakened something in Marcus that would change both their lives forever. The war might have scarred his face, but her betrayal had scarred his soul. And unlike his physical wounds, this one would not go unaddressed. For 2 weeks after that humiliating night at La Maison, Marcus didn't leave his small apartment above Joe's hardware store. The cramped space that had once felt like a temporary shelter now became his fortress against the world. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from concerned friends and family, but he ignored them all. The only sounds that filled his days were the echoes of Rachel's laughter and the phantom explosions that haunted his dreams. His sister Sarah tried everything to get him to open the door. "Marcus, please," she'd beg, her voice muffled through the thick wood. "You can't let her win like this. You're stronger than this. You survived a war, for God's sake." But surviving war was different from surviving humiliation. In combat, at least he knew who his enemies were. The local newspaper didn't help. Someone had captured the moment at the restaurant on their phone, and the story spread like wildfire through Cedar Springs social media. "Local war hero faces new battle, heartbreak at La Maison," read one particularly cruel headline. The comment section was filled with a mix of pity and mockery, each word driving the knife deeper into Marcus's already wounded pride. On the 15th day of his self-imposed exile, something changed. Marcus was sitting in his usual spot by the window, watching the town go about its business below, when he saw Rachel and James walking down Main Street. They stopped in front of the hardware store, and Rachel was gesturing excitedly at the building across the street, the old Peterson building, a historic structure that had been empty for years. "It's perfect for our new real estate office," he heard Rachel say through the cracked window. "Once we get the investment group's money, we can finally expand beyond this pathetic little town." James laughed, pulling her close. "And once we close that deal with the Veterans Housing Project, we'll have more than enough to get started." Marcus's military training kicked in, his senses sharpened, focusing on every word. He knew about the Veterans Housing Project. It was supposed to provide affordable homes for returning service members, something the town desperately needed. The government had allocated significant funds for it, and Rachel's firm had somehow won the contract to develop it. "Those suckers think we're building them dream homes," James continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "By the time they realize we've cut every corner possible, we'll be long gone with the profits." Rachel's response made Marcus's blood run cold. "It's not like they deserve better. Most of them are so messed up they probably won't even notice. Look at Marcus. He couldn't even handle a simple dinner without breaking down." As their laughter faded down the street, Marcus felt something shift inside him. The fog of depression lifted, replaced by a crystal-clear sense of purpose. This wasn't just about his humiliation anymore. It was about protecting his fellow veterans from being exploited by Rachel's greed. He got up and took a shower for the first time in days. As the hot water washed over his scars, his military mind began to work, analyzing the situation like a battlefield. Rachel had two weaknesses, her ambition and her arrogance. She thought she'd broken him, but she'd forgotten one crucial thing. Veterans are trained to turn defeat into victory. Marcus opened his laptop and started researching. Rachel's real estate firm, Mitchell and Hartford Properties, had an impressive website showcasing their success stories. But buried in the local news archives, he found interesting patterns. Properties they'd developed had a history of cutting corners, but they'd always managed to avoid serious consequences through Rachel's connections and charm. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in months. "Hey, Rodriguez," he said when his old war buddy answered. "Remember how you said you owed me one after Kandahar? I need your help with something. You still working in banking?" As night fell over Cedar Springs, Marcus stood in front of his bathroom mirror, really looking at his reflection for the first time since returning home. The scars that had made him feel ashamed now reminded him of his strength. He had survived worse than Rachel Mitchell. She thought she was fighting a broken man, but she was about to face a warrior. "Time to go to war," he whispered to his reflection, a plan already forming in his mind. This wouldn't be a battle fought with guns and grenades, but with information and patience. Rachel had no idea, but she had just created her own worst enemy. A man with nothing left to lose and the training to make her regret every cruel word. In his bedroom, Marcus set up a planning board, just like the ones they used for mission briefings overseas. In the center, he pinned a photo of Rachel from her company website, surrounded by notes about her business dealings, social connections, and most importantly, her plans for the Veterans Housing Project. This would be his most important mission yet, not for country this time, but for justice. As he worked through the night, the sound of Rachel's laughter no longer haunted him. Instead, it fueled him. She thought she had destroyed him that night at La Maison, but instead, she had given him something he'd lost since returning from war. A mission worthy of his skills. Marcus's first step in his carefully crafted plan came through his old war buddy, Rodriguez. Now, a senior loan officer at First Montana Bank, Rodriguez had access to the kind of information that could make or break real estate deals. When they met at the quiet end of O'Malley's bar, Rodriguez's face turned grim as he looked through the documents Marcus had gathered. "Man, this is worse than we thought," Rodriguez said, sliding a folder across the table. "Rachel and James aren't just cutting corners on the Veterans Housing Project. They're running a full-scale scam. They're using the same contractors who built that mall in Riverside that collapsed last year." Marcus took a slow sip of his coffee, his military training helping him maintain his composure despite the anger burning inside. "Tell me everything." "They've set up shell companies to hide where the money's really going. The materials they're planning to use wouldn't pass inspection in a third-world country, let alone Montana. But here's the kicker. They've somehow got Building Inspector Thompson in their pocket. He's signed off on everything without even looking at the plans." As they talked, a woman at the bar kept glancing their way. Marcus noticed her reflection in the window. Sharp eyes, professional attire, notebook in hand. His combat instincts tingled. "We've got company," he muttered to Rodriguez. Before either of them could move, the woman approached their table. "Gentlemen," she said, sliding into the empty chair. "I couldn't help but overhear parts of your conversation. My name is Diana Chen, investigative reporter for the Cedar Springs Chronicle." Marcus's hand tensed under the table, but Diana raised her hands in a peaceful gesture. "I've been investigating Mitchell and Hartford properties for months. There's more to this story than even you know, and I think we can help each other." Over the next hour, Diana shared her findings. Rachel and James weren't just scamming the Veterans Housing Project. They were part of a larger scheme involving corrupt city officials and stolen pension funds. Diana had been gathering evidence, but she needed someone on the inside to help her connect the dots. "Why should we trust you?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying the edge of someone who'd learned the hard way about trust. Diana pulled out her phone and showed them a photo. It was her father in military uniform. He was in Vietnam. Came home to find that the housing promised to veterans had been sold off to developers. Ended up living in his car for 3 years. "This isn't just a story for me. It's personal." Marcus studied her face, using the same instincts that had kept him alive in combat. She was telling the truth. "All right," he said finally. "But we do this my way. I've got experience in running operations where failure isn't an option." That night, in Marcus's apartment, The three of them began planning. Diana's investigation had revealed that Rachel and James were hosting a huge investment gala in 2 weeks. They were planning to announce their expansion plans and secure funding from major investors. "That's our target," Marcus said, pinning the gala invitation to his planning board. "They think they're untouchable because of their connections. But in my experience, the bigger they are, the harder they fall." Rodriguez pulled out his laptop. "I can get you the banking records showing the money trail, but we need someone who can understand all this financial jargon." "Leave that to me," Diana said. "I know just the person, Professor Adams from the local college. He's been helping me make sense of the financial documents. He's also a veteran, served in the First Gulf War." As they worked through their plan, Marcus felt a familiar sensation. The calm focus that came before a mission. But this time, something was different. In Afghanistan, he'd fought for survival. Here, he was fighting for justice. The next few days were a blur of activity. Diana dug deeper into the corruption, discovering that Rachel had been using her charm to manipulate not just Marcus, but countless others. She'd left a trail of broken promises and ruined lives behind her perfectly manicured facade. Rodriguez worked his connections in the banking world, quietly gathering evidence of financial irregularities. Professor Adams helped them understand the complex web of transactions that Rachel and James had created to hide their scheme. But it was Sarah, Marcus's sister, who provided the most surprising help. As a nurse at Cedar Springs General Hospital, she had access to social circles that Rachel thought she controlled. "You won't believe what I heard in the break room," she told Marcus one evening. "Rachel's been bragging about how she's going to use the Veterans Project to launch her political career. She's planning to run for mayor next year." Marcus added this new information to his planning board. The pieces were falling into place, but timing would be crucial. They needed everything to come together at exactly the right moment during the gala. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, looking at the elaborate plan laid out before them. "Rachel's powerful. She's got half the town in her pocket." Marcus touched the scar on his face, remembering the night at La Maison. "That's exactly why she needs to be stopped. Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought on foreign soil. They're fought right here at home, against enemies hiding in plain sight." As he looked at his growing team, Rodriguez with his banking expertise, Diana with her investigative skills, Professor Adams with his financial knowledge, and Sarah with her community connections, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the Marines: the strength of having a reliable unit at his back. Rachel thought she had humiliated a broken soldier. Instead, she had awakened a warrior and given him a new mission. The gala was approaching, and with it, the chance to expose the truth. But first, they needed to prepare for every possible contingency. In war, as in revenge, the key to victory lies in the details. As the day of the gala drew closer, Marcus and his team worked tirelessly to perfect their plan. Diana's investigation had uncovered something even more disturbing. Rachel's firm wasn't just planning to scam the Veterans Housing Project. They were also buying up large portions of downtown Cedar Springs through shell companies planning to destroy the town's historic buildings for luxury developments. One evening, while reviewing documents in his apartment, Marcus received an unexpected visit. It was Tom Peterson, owner of the historic building Rachel had been eyeing. The elderly man looked worried as he sat down heavily in Marcus's worn armchair. "Son, I heard you've been asking questions about Mitchell and Hartford properties," Tom said, his weathered hands clutching a manila envelope. "There's something you need to see." Inside the envelope were letters dating back months, showing how Rachel and James had been pressuring local business owners to sell their properties. They'd used everything from threats to blackmail, hiding behind lawyers and shell companies. Tom's voice cracked as he explained how Rachel had threatened to expose his daughter's struggle with addiction if he didn't sell his building. "This town's been my family's home for 4 generations, Tom said, wiping his eyes. "That building was my father's legacy. But what choice do I have?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "Mr. Peterson, what if I told you there was a way to stop them? But I'd need your help." The old man straightened in his chair, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Son, after what you did for our country, anything you need is yours." That night, after Tom left, Marcus called an emergency meeting with his team. They gathered in the back room of O'Malley's bar, where Rodriguez laid out what they'd learned about the financial side of Rachel's operation. "She's leveraged everything on this veterans project," Rodriguez explained, spreading bank documents across the table. "The construction loans, the downtown acquisitions, it all hinges on getting those government funds. Without them, the whole house of cards comes down." Diana added her findings, pointing to a complex web of connections she'd mapped out. "Rachel's got half the city council in her pocket, but here's the interesting part. She's been recording all her meetings with them. My source at City Hall says she uses these recordings as insurance." "Classic intelligence gathering," Marcus nodded, recognizing the tactic from his military days. "She makes sure everyone who deals with her has something to lose if they turn against her?" Sarah, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "There's more. I overheard Rachel at the hospital today, arguing with James in the parking lot. She's planning to double-cross him after the gala, pin everything on him if things go wrong. She was waving some kind of USB drive in his face." Marcus's mind raced with this new information. Rachel wasn't just corrupt, she was prepared to sacrifice everyone around her to save herself, just like she'd sacrificed him that night at La Maison. Professor Adams, who had been analyzing the financial documents, looked up from his laptop. "The numbers don't lie. They're planning to embezzle over $15 million from the Veterans Housing Project. But here's what's really interesting. Rachel's been moving money into offshore accounts under her name only. She's planning to leave James holding the bag." As they refined their plan for the gala, Marcus received another piece of unexpected intelligence. One of his old Marine buddies, now working private security, had been hired for the event. "They're sparing no expense, Marcus," he reported. "Black tie, valet parking, the works. Rachel's even hired a string quartet. She's trying to impress some big-shot investors from Chicago." The pieces were falling into place. Rachel had orchestrated her rise through careful manipulation and blackmail, recording every dirty deal and compromise. She thought these recordings made her untouchable, but Marcus knew from combat that the strongest fortifications could become traps if you knew how to use them. "The gala's not just a celebration," Marcus told his team as they finalized their strategy. "It's Rachel's coronation. She thinks it's her moment of triumph, but it's really her vulnerability. She'll have everyone she's ever manipulated or betrayed in one room, desperate to prove their loyalty." Diana looked up from her notes. "My sources say she's planning to announce her mayoral campaign that night. She's going to use the Veterans Housing Project as proof of her community service." Marcus felt a cold smile cross his face. "Perfect. The bigger the audience, the better." They worked through the night, each person knowing their role. Rodriguez would monitor the financial transactions. Diana had her camera ready to document everything. Professor Adams prepared to explain the complex fraud to the investors. Sarah and Tom Peterson would help gather the other business owners who'd been pressured by Rachel. As dawn broke over Cedar Springs, Marcus stood at his window, watching the town wake up. In his hand was the invitation to the gala. Rachel had sent it to him as a final twist of the knife, probably expecting him to stay away in shame. "All warfare is based on deception," he murmured, remembering his training. Rachel thought she was the master manipulator, but she'd never faced an opponent trained in military strategy. In her arrogance, she'd made the classic mistake, underestimating a wounded enemy. The gala was 2 days away. Soon Rachel would learn that some scars run too deep to heal, and some betrayals demand a reckoning. Marcus touched the purple heart pinned to his dress uniform, hanging ready for the gala. The medal reminded him that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about facing your fears and doing what needed to be done anyway. The stage was set, the players were in position, and Rachel's carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. The night of the gala arrived with an air of electric anticipation. The Grand Cedar Hotel's ballroom had been transformed into a showcase of wealth and power. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the gathered elite of Cedar Springs, while waiters in crisp black uniforms weaved through the crowd with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Marcus stood in front of his bathroom mirror, adjusting his dress uniform one last time. Every medal and ribbon told a story of sacrifice and courage. His fingers lingered on the deep scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the mark that had made Rachel recoil in disgust that night at La Maison. Tonight, it would be his badge of honor. "Everything's in place," Sarah said, entering his apartment. She was stunning in a blue evening gown, her press pass for the Chronicle discreetly tucked into her clutch. Diana's already inside, mingling with the investors. Rodriguez has eyes on the banking terminals. Marcus nodded, his military training keeping his nerves steady. "And Tom Peterson? He's gathered 15 other business owners who were threatened by Rachel. They're waiting for your signal." Sarah paused, touching her brother's arm. "Are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back." "I was sure the moment she used my scars against me," Marcus replied, his voice firm. "This isn't just about revenge anymore, it's about justice." They arrived at the Grand Cedar just as Rachel was making her grand entrance. She wore a stunning red dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her arm linked with James's as they greeted their guests. The sight of them together made Marcus's stomach turn, but he maintained his composure. "Marcus," Rachel's voice carried across the lobby, dripping with false warmth. "I'm so glad you could make it." She approached him playing the gracious host. Up close he could see the calculated gleam in her eyes. She thought his presence was a sign of weakness, that he had come to witness her triumph. "I wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied smoothly. "A veteran never abandons his post." Rachel's smile flickered for just a moment, uncertainty crossing her face. But before she could respond, James appeared at her side. "Well, if it isn't the broken soldier," he smirked just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Here to see what real success looks like?" Marcus simply smiled, remembering his combat training. "Let the enemy underestimate you." "Oh, I'm here to see quite a show," he said, moving past them into the ballroom. Inside, the operation was already in motion. Diana was chatting with a group of Chicago investors, subtly planting seeds of doubt about Mitchell and Hartford's financial stability. Professor Adams had positioned himself near the stage, ready to explain the complex fraud in terms anyone could understand. Tom Peterson and his group of business owners were scattered throughout the room, each carrying copies of Rachel's threatening letters. Marcus made his way to the bar, ordering a club soda with lime. His earpiece crackled to life, Rodriguez's voice coming through clearly. "Banking terminals are ready. We've got access to all the offshore account records." Rachel took the stage, tapping her glass for attention. The room fell silent as she began her speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight marks a new chapter for Cedar Springs," she announced, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "Mitchell and Hartford Properties is proud to announce our Veterans Housing Initiative, a project that will show our commitment to those who served our country." Marcus watched as she wove her web of lies, painting herself as a community savior. She even had the audacity to gesture toward him, using his presence to legitimize her claims. "We understand the sacrifices our veterans have made," she continued, her eyes meeting his with mock sincerity. "And we're here to ensure they receive the quality homes they deserve." But just as Rachel was about to reveal the project's details, Diana's voice cut through the room. "Would those be the same quality homes being built by the contractors responsible for the Riverside Mall collapse?" The room went silent. Rachel's smile froze on her face as Diana stood, holding up documents. "Or perhaps you'd like to explain why the project's funds are being routed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands." James stepped forward, attempting damage control. "These are baseless accusations. Ms. Mitchell has a proven track record of fraud and blackmail." Tom Peterson's voice boomed from the back of the room. He stepped forward, other business owners joining him. "We have the letters, Rachel. All your threats, all your schemes." The room erupted in whispers as Rachel's carefully constructed facade began to crack. Her eyes darted around the room, looking for allies but finding only accusing stares. The investors from Chicago were already heading for the door. Marcus watched it all unfold, remembering another time when he'd seen an enemy's defenses crumble. But this battle wasn't over yet. Rachel still had one card to play, her USB drive full of compromising recordings. And right on cue, she reached for her clutch. Her face went pale. The clutch was empty. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. Phase 1 was complete. But the real fireworks were still to come. Rachel Mitchell was about to learn that a wounded warrior knows how to turn pain into power and humiliation into victory. Rachel's composure cracked as she frantically searched her clutch again. The missing USB drive contained not just evidence of her crimes, but her insurance policy against everyone she'd ever manipulated. Her eyes locked onto Marcus, recognition dawning on her face. "You," she hissed, stepping down from the stage. "What did you do?" Marcus calmly pulled the USB drive from his uniform pocket, holding it up for all to see. "Looking for this?" His voice carried across the now silent ballroom. "Amazing what you can find when you have friends in the right places." James rushed forward, reaching for the drive, but Marcus's combat reflexes were too quick. He stepped aside, causing James to stumble. "Careful now," Marcus warned. "You wouldn't want to assault a decorated veteran in front of all these witnesses." Diana had already connected her laptop to the ballroom's projection system. "Shall we see what's on this, Rachel?" All those private conversations with city officials, all those backroom deals. "You can't do this," Rachel's voice trembled, her carefully maintained facade crumbling. "Do you know who I am? Who I know?" "Oh, we know exactly who you are," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "A manipulator, a fraud, someone who thinks she can use people's pain for profit." He turned to address the crowd. "Would you like to know what really happened to the $15 million allocated for veterans' housing?" Professor Adams stepped forward, presenting financial documents on the screen. "The money was diverted through a series of shell companies," he explained, pointing to complex diagrams. "Instead of building quality homes for veterans, they planned to construct substandard housing using cheap materials, pocketing the difference." The Chicago investors who had been heading for the door stopped to listen. One of them, a sharp-dressed woman, spoke up. "Is this true, Ms. Mitchell? Were you planning to defraud veterans?" Rachel's response was cut off by a new voice. "She's done worse." Through the crowd came Jerry Thompson, the building inspector she had bribed. "She threatened to expose my son's medical condition if I didn't approve her unsafe building plans, but I can't live with that guilt anymore, not after what happened in Riverside." The room erupted in chaos. Business owners began sharing their stories of blackmail and threats. City officials, seeing the writing on the wall, started admitting to their roles in Rachel's schemes. James, realizing he was about to take the fall, turned on Rachel. "It was all her idea," he shouted, pointing at Rachel. "She's the one who recorded everything. She's been planning to betray everyone, even me." Rachel's face contorted with fury. She lunged for the USB drive in Marcus's hand, her composure completely shattered. "You think you've won?" she screamed. "You're nothing but a broken soldier, a scarred freak who—" Her words were cut off by Sarah's steady voice. "That's enough, Rachel." Sarah stepped forward, phone in hand. "I've been recording everything you've said tonight, every insult, every admission, and unlike you, I'm streaming it live." The ballroom doors burst open as local police entered, led by Diana's contact from the FBI's white-collar crime division. "Rachel Mitchell," the agent announced, "we have a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and corruption." As the officers approached, Rachel made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "Marcus," she pleaded, her voice suddenly soft, reminiscent of the girl he once loved. "Please, we can work something out. Remember all those letters we wrote? I kept them all." Marcus stepped closer, looking directly into her eyes. "You know what your mistake was, Rachel. You thought these scars made me weak." He touched his face. "But every scar tells a story of survival. You didn't break me that night at La Maison. You just reminded me what I'm fighting for." The police led Rachel and James away in handcuffs, their perfect image shattered forever. The Chicago investors immediately withdrew their support, and city officials began falling over themselves to cooperate with the investigation. Tom Peterson approached Marcus, tears in his eyes. "Son, you've saved more than just your fellow veterans tonight. You've saved our whole town." As the crowd dispersed and reporters swarmed in for statements, Marcus stood with his team, Sarah, Diana, Rodriguez, and Professor Adams. They had achieved more than revenge. They had exposed corruption, prevented fraud, and protected vulnerable veterans. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, watching the last police car drive away. Marcus smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Now we make sure those veterans get the homes they were promised. Real homes, built with respect and honor." Diana held up her camera. "And I'll make sure everyone knows the real story. Not just about Rachel's crimes, but about how a group of dedicated people fought back against corruption." "There's something poetic about it," Rodriguez mused. "She thought she could use your scars against you, but they became her undoing." As the night drew to a close, Marcus took one last look around the ballroom where Rachel's empire had crumbled. The physical and emotional scars he carried would always be part of him, but they no longer defined him. Tonight, they had helped him protect others from experiencing their own scars of betrayal and fraud. He touched his Purple Heart one last time before leaving. Some battles leave visible scars, others invisible ones. But tonight had proved that true strength isn't about having no scars. It's about wearing them with honor and using them to fight for what's right. 6 months after the dramatic events at the Grand Cedar Hotel, Cedar Springs had transformed. The autumn leaves painted the town in rich colors as Marcus walked down Main Street, nodding to familiar faces. Where there had once been whispers and pitying glances, he now received respectful greetings and warm smiles. The local newspaper's headline caught his eye from a newsstand. "Mitchell and Hartford Scandal Leads to Nationwide Investigation of Veterans Housing Fraud." Diana's exposé had gone viral, attracting national attention to the issue of corruption in veterans' housing projects. Her story had even won her a prestigious journalism award. Marcus stopped at the construction site of the new veterans' housing development. The project, now under honest management, was taking shape properly. Quality materials filled the site, and the homes were being built to exceed safety standards. Tom Peterson had been appointed to the oversight committee, ensuring everything was done right this time. "Looking good, isn't it?" Rodriguez appeared beside him, clipboard in hand. He had left his banking job to become the project's financial supervisor. Every penny accounted for, every contract transparent. This is what it should have been from the start. The sound of hammering and construction filled the air as veterans themselves worked on the project. Marcus had insisted on hiring qualified veterans for the construction, giving them not just homes but jobs and purpose. The site had become a symbol of redemption and community. "Got some news about Rachel," Rodriguez continued, his voice lower. "She and James both took plea deals. She's looking at 15 years for fraud and corruption. James got 10. But here's the kicker. They're making them pay back every cent they stole, plus damages." Marcus nodded, satisfaction settling in his chest. The money would go towards expanding the housing project, helping even more veterans. Rachel's web of corruption had been completely unraveled, leading to investigations in other cities and the exposure of similar schemes across the country. Later that afternoon, Marcus had a session at the Veterans Center, but this time he wasn't there as a patient. The center had asked him to help counsel other veterans struggling with their return to civilian life. His story of overcoming humiliation and fighting corruption had become an inspiration. "The scars don't define you," he told a young veteran who had just returned from overseas. "They're proof that you survived, that you're stronger than whatever tried to break you." The words carried extra weight coming from someone who had transformed his own pain into purpose. Sarah visited him that evening at his new office in the restored Peterson building. She brought coffee and news from the hospital. "Remember Thompson, the building inspector? His son's treatment is going well. The fund we set up with the recovered money is helping a lot of families." Marcus smiled, looking around his office. After the scandal, he had started a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting veterans' rights and preventing housing fraud. The walls were covered with thank you letters from veterans and their families. "Did you see today's mail?" Sarah asked, pulling out an envelope. It was from Rachel, sent from prison. Marcus had received several letters from her over the months, all unopened. He took the letter and without hesitation dropped it in the shredder. "Some chapters need to stay closed," he said simply. The sun was setting as Marcus left his office, casting long shadows across Main Street. He walked to the small diner where he and Rachel had once shared ice cream as teenagers. The place had new owners now, a veteran and his wife who had been among the first to move into the completed housing units. "The usual, Marcus?" called Jenny, the owner's wife, as he entered. The diner had become a regular gathering place for veterans, a safe space where they could find community and support. As he sat at the counter, Marcus caught his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The scars were still there, but they no longer carried the weight of shame. They were battle marks, testaments to survival, reminders of victories both on and off the battlefield. His phone buzzed. A message from Diana. She was working on a new story investigating similar housing frauds in other cities. "Want to help more veterans?" Her message read, "This could be bigger than Cedar Springs." Marcus smiled, already knowing his answer. Rachel had thought she was destroying him that night at La Maison, but she had actually set him on a path to his true purpose. His military training, his experience with betrayal, even his scars. Everything had prepared him for this mission of protecting others from corruption and exploitation. The diner's television was playing the evening news. A reporter was interviewing Tom Peterson about the success of the Veterans Housing Project. "This is what happens when we honor our commitments to those who served," Tom was saying, "when we choose integrity over greed." As Marcus listened, he felt a deep sense of peace. The revenge he had sought had transformed into something far more meaningful, a mission to ensure that no other veteran would face the kind of betrayal and corruption he had exposed. Outside, the streets of Cedar Springs were quiet as night fell. The town had healed from Rachel's schemes, emerging stronger and more united. And Marcus, the scarred warrior who had once been humiliated and mocked, had found his true calling, not in revenge, but in justice and protection. His phone buzzed again. More veterans needed help. More battles needed fighting. Marcus Anderson, decorated Marine and defender of veterans' rights, was ready. After all, a warrior's duty never really ends. It just finds new ways to serve. 5 years after the events that shook Cedar Springs, Marcus sat in his Washington, D.C. office, reviewing the latest legislation on veterans' housing protection. The walls of his office were covered with framed newspaper articles chronicling his journey from local whistleblower to national veterans' rights advocate. The largest headline read, "Veterans Fight Against Corruption Leads to National Housing Reform Act." His phone buzzed. Diana was calling from New York. She had become a prominent investigative journalist, specializing in exposing corruption in veterans' affairs. "Marcus, turn on the news," she said without preamble. "They're releasing Rachel early for good behavior." Marcus switched on the television mounted on his office wall. There she was, Rachel Mitchell, walking out of the federal prison in Minneapolis. 5 years had changed her dramatically. The designer clothes and perfect makeup were gone, replaced by a simpler, almost humble appearance. She was clutching a book to her chest, and Marcus recognized it immediately. It was her memoir, Fall from Grace, a story of redemption. "Have you read it?" Diana asked, knowing Marcus had avoided anything related to Rachel for years. "No need," Marcus replied, his voice calm. "The past is the past." He touched the scar on his face, a gesture that had become more of a reminder of triumph than trauma. "How's the investigation into the California housing scandal going?" "That's actually why I called," Diana said. "Remember Rodriguez? He's tracked the money trail to some big names in Sacramento. We're going to need your help on this one." The Cedar Springs Veterans Housing Project had become a national model for ethical development. Tom Peterson had turned his experience into a consulting firm, helping other communities implement similar oversight systems. The old Peterson building now housed the headquarters of the Veterans Housing Protection Alliance, a nationwide organization that had grown from Marcus's initial fight for justice. Later that afternoon, Marcus had a speaking engagement at the National Veterans Conference. As he stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, some scarred like his, others bearing invisible wounds, he shared not just his story of revenge, but the larger mission it had sparked. 5 years ago, I thought revenge would heal my wounds, he told the crowd. But I discovered something more powerful, the ability to prevent others from being wounded in the first place. Every scar we carry is a lesson, every betrayal an opportunity to protect others. After the speech, a young veteran approached him. She had severe burn scars from an IED in Afghanistan. "Your story helped me realize something," she said. "Our scars don't make us victims. They make us warriors in a different kind of battle." That evening, Marcus received an unexpected email. It was from James Hartford, Rachel's former partner. He had served his sentence and was now working with a veterans rehabilitation program in Minnesota. The email contained a simple message: "You were right. Sometimes the worst wounds lead us to our true purpose." Marcus thought about how much had changed. The scandal that had started in Cedar Springs had exposed similar schemes across the country, leading to major reforms in veterans' housing programs. Sarah had become a leading advocate for veterans' health care, using her nursing experience to fight for better medical services. Professor Adams had developed a financial literacy program specifically for veterans, helping them protect themselves from predatory schemes. As he prepared to leave his office, Marcus's assistant handed him a letter. The return address was from Cedar Springs. Inside was an invitation to the 10-year anniversary celebration of the veterans' housing community. The project had grown to include not just homes, but a community center, job training facilities, and mental health services. The letter included a photo of the community's entrance. Above the gate was a simple plaque that read, "Every scar tells a story of survival. Every home tells a story of healing." The words were familiar. They were his own, spoken during that confrontation at the Grand Cedar Hotel 5 years ago. His phone buzzed again. Rodriguez this time. "You're not going to believe what we found in Sacramento," he said. "It's bigger than Cedar Springs ever was, multiple cities, hundreds of veterans affected. We need your expertise on this one, Marcus." Marcus smiled, already reaching for his jacket. The battle that had started as personal revenge had evolved into an endless war against corruption, fought not with weapons, but with truth, justice, and unwavering determination. As he left the office, a news alert popped up on his phone. Rachel's memoir had hit the bestseller list. The description read, "A story of how one woman's cruel actions led to her downfall, and how the man she tried to break ended up changing the nation." Marcus switched off his phone. He had a plane to catch, more veterans to protect, more battles to fight. The scars that Rachel had once mocked had become his badges of honor, marking not just what he had survived, but what he had transformed into something greater than revenge, a legacy of protection, justice, and hope for veterans across the nation. The sun was setting over the capital as his car headed toward the airport. Another city, another fight against corruption. Marcus Anderson, the scarred warrior who had turned personal humiliation into national reform, was ready. After all, some battles were worth fighting forever. The Sacramento investigation had barely begun when Marcus received an urgent call from Diana. "We've got another situation," she said, her voice tense. "A Marine named Jason Cooper. His story, it's eerily similar to yours." Marcus sat back in his hotel room, listening as Diana explained. Jason Cooper had returned from Iraq with severe burns covering half his face. Like Marcus years ago, he had fallen victim to someone he trusted, in this case, a prominent real estate developer named Victoria Kane, who had used his vulnerability to further her own ambitions. "She did a real number on him," Diana continued. "Used him as the face of her veteran housing charity, promised him the world, then humiliated him at a fundraising gala when a wealthy investor showed interest in her instead. Now she's trying to push through a massive development project using federal funds meant for veteran housing. Marcus felt a familiar fire ignite in his chest. "Send me everything you have." Within hours, he was reviewing the files. Victoria Kane's operation made Rachel's schemes look amateur. She had operations in 3 states, all using veteran causes as fronts for luxury developments. But it was the video of the gala that caught Marcus's attention. Jason Cooper standing alone on stage, humiliated, as Victoria laughed with her wealthy new prospect. "History repeats itself," Marcus muttered, touching his own scar. He found Jason at the local VA hospital where he worked as a janitor. The young Marine's burns were severe, but it was the defeat in his eyes that Marcus recognized most. "You don't know me," Marcus began, "but I know exactly what you're going through." Over coffee in the hospital cafeteria, Marcus shared his story, not the sanitized version from the news, but the raw truth about pain, humiliation, and the path to justice. Jason listened, his hands gripping his coffee cup tightly. "She's untouchable," Jason finally said. "Victoria's got connections all the way to the governor's office." Marcus smiled. Rachel thought she was untouchable too. "Let me ask you something. Are you ready to fight back?" That evening, Marcus called an emergency meeting with his team. Rodriguez flew in from Washington, Diana arrived from New York, and Professor Adams joined via secure video link. "We've got another Rachel," Marcus announced, "and this time we're taking down the entire network." Sarah, who had been quiet during the briefing, spoke up. "It's not just about Victoria Kane, is it? This is about making sure there are no more Rachels or Victorias." Marcus nodded. "Every scar has a story. It's time to make sure these stories stop repeating." Over the next few days, they built their strategy. Rodriguez discovered that Victoria's charity was laundering money through veteran art therapy programs. Diana found connections to corrupt officials in multiple states. Professor Adams identified patterns in the financial records that suggested a much larger conspiracy. But it was Jason who provided the key. "She records everything," he said during a strategy session. "Said it's for a documentary about veteran recovery. But really, she's gathering material to manipulate and control people." Marcus remembered Rachel's USB drive. "Some habits are universal," he mused. "The powerful always keep insurance." They set their plan in motion at Victoria's next major fundraising event, the grand opening of her Veterans Cultural Center, which was really a front for a luxury shopping complex. Jason, with newly restored confidence, agreed to play a central role. Victoria Kane stood at the podium, perfectly poised in designer clothes, speaking about her dedication to veteran causes. The audience of wealthy donors and politicians nodded appreciatively, unaware that among them sat members of Marcus's team, carefully coordinating their moves. "And now," Victoria announced, "I'd like to introduce someone special, Jason Cooper, whose inspiring story of recovery touches us all." Jason walked to the stage, his scarred face held high. But instead of delivering the prepared speech about Victoria's generosity, he spoke the truth. Every word, every betrayal, every manipulation. As he spoke, screens behind him displayed evidence of Victoria's fraud. Documents, recordings, bank transfers. Victoria lunged for the microphone, but her movement was interrupted by federal agents emerging from the crowd. Diana's investigation had provided enough evidence for multiple indictments. As Victoria was led away in handcuffs, she locked eyes with Marcus. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Just another scarred veteran who learned to fight back," he replied. Later that night, as the team celebrated their success, Jason approached Marcus. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not just for taking her down, but for showing me these scars don't make us victims." Marcus looked around the room at his team, at all they had accomplished since that night at the Grand Cedar Hotel years ago. "You know," he said to Jason, "there's a place for you in our organization. We could use someone who understands what it's like to turn pain into purpose. As they discussed the future, Marcus's phone buzzed with messages from veterans across the country, each sharing stories of corruption and betrayal in their communities. The fight was far from over, but with each victory, they grew stronger. "Ready for the next battle?" Marcus asked Jason. The younger veteran straightened his shoulders, a familiar fire now burning in his eyes. "Lead the way, sir." 10 years to the day after Rachel's downfall at the Grand Cedar Hotel, Marcus stood at the podium of the National Veterans Rights Convention in Washington, D.C. The massive auditorium was packed with faces bearing all kinds of scars, some visible, some hidden, all carrying stories of survival. "A decade ago," Marcus began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "I thought revenge would heal my wounds. I was a broken soldier, humiliated by someone I trusted, seeking nothing but payback. But what started as one man's quest for vengeance has become something far greater." The screens behind him displayed images: the completed Cedar Springs Veterans Housing Community, Jason Cooper's Rehabilitation Center in Sacramento, similar projects across the country. Each one represented a battle won, not just against corruption, but against the exploitation of veterans' vulnerability. Rachel had been released from prison 2 years ago. She had written to Marcus one final time, not asking for forgiveness, but acknowledging how her cruelty had inadvertently sparked a national movement. The letter remained unopened in his desk drawer. Some chapters were better left closed. Diana, now a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, sat in the front row. Her investigations had exposed similar schemes in 37 states, leading to major reforms in veterans' housing programs. Beside her sat Rodriguez, who had transformed his banking expertise into a nationwide financial protection program for veterans. "Our scars," Marcus continued, touching the mark on his face that had once caused him so much shame, "are not our weakness. They are proof of our strength, maps of the battles we've survived. But more than that, they are reminders of our duty to protect others from similar wounds." Jason Cooper, now Marcus's right-hand man in the Veterans Protection Alliance, stepped up to join him at the podium. Together, they unveiled their most ambitious project yet: a nationwide network of veterans advocacy centers, combining housing assistance, legal aid, and psychological support. 10 years ago, a woman named Rachel Mitchell thought she could break a scarred soldier, Marcus said, his voice strong with purpose. "She didn't realize that some wounds don't break us. They forge us into warriors of a different kind. Today we don't fight with weapons, but with truth. We don't seek revenge, but justice. We don't hide our scars, we wear them as badges of honor." The audience rose in a standing ovation, but Marcus wasn't finished. He gestured to the back of the auditorium, where the doors opened to reveal a group of people entering. Tom Peterson, now elderly but still standing tall. Sarah, who had established the largest veterans' mental health network in the country. Professor Adams, whose financial literacy program had protected thousands from fraud, and dozens of veterans whose lives had been transformed by their work. "Look around you," Marcus continued as the group made their way to the stage. "Every person in this room has a story. Every scar tells a tale of survival. But together we're writing a new story, one of protection, justice, and hope." As if on cue, news alerts began buzzing through the crowd. Victoria Kane's nationwide corruption network had finally been fully exposed, leading to the largest veterans protection legislature in American history. The bill was named the Anderson Act, in honor of Marcus's decade-long fight. "A wise man once told me that revenge is a temporary satisfaction, but justice is an eternal victory," Marcus said, nodding to an elderly veteran in the front row, the same man who had counseled him during his darkest days after Rachel's humiliation. "Today, we're not just winning battles, we're changing the war itself." The convention center erupted in applause as Marcus introduced the next generation of veteran advocates, young men and women trained to spot corruption, protect their fellow veterans, and transform their own scars into sources of strength. After the ceremony, Marcus stood alone on the convention center's balcony, looking out over the capital city. Sarah joined him, holding a newspaper with the headline, From personal revenge to national reform, the Marcus Anderson story. Did you ever imagine, she asked, that night at the Grand Cedar Hotel, that it would lead to all this? Marcus smiled, touching his scar one last time. You know what Rachel never understood? These scars, they were never about what we lost. They're about what we found. Purpose, strength, and a mission bigger than ourselves. As the sun set over Washington, Marcus could see lights coming on in veteran centers across the city, beacons of hope and protection that had grown from seeds of revenge. His phone buzzed with messages from Jason and Diana about new cases needing attention, new battles to be fought. The scarred warrior who had once sought only revenge had found something far more powerful, a legacy of justice that would outlast any personal vindication. Rachel's cruelty had aimed to break him, but instead, it had forged him into a protector, a leader, and a symbol of transformation. The war wasn't over. It never would be as long as there were vulnerable veterans to protect. But now they fought not from pain or revenge, but from a place of strength and purpose. Every scar told a story, and together, they were writing a new chapter in the history of veterans' rights. Marcus picked up his phone, ready for the next mission. After all, some battles were worth fighting forever, not for revenge, but for justice.